Hello, and Madad, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Social Engagement and Loneliness in Dementia, Why Connection Matters. My name is Mumtaz Lakhani, and I'm a nurse by education. I work as a Director of Care for Right at Home Home Care and Assistance for the province of Manitoba. I serve as the National Operations Lead for Care for the Elderly portfolio. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar aims to deepen our understanding of dementia beyond memory loss, explore the powerful impact of loneliness, and equip families, caregivers, and community members with practical, evidence-based information and strategies to foster connection, dignity, and belonging for people living with dementia, while also supporting the caregivers and their families. Before we start, we would like to thank all the volunteers that have helped us make this webinar possible. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement, where we acknowledge the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are situated on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of these lands, the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people across Canada that can call this nation home. We do this to affirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationship between the nations and to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures. Before we get started, we would like to inform the audience that any information that is provided in this webinar should not be considered specific medical advice and is not intended as a substitute for medical professional help, guidance, diagnosis, or treatment. We remind our audience to seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare providers with any questions you have regarding your medical care. The speakers today are not affiliated with any specific product related to this presentation, nor do they endorse them. I would like to start with a story here. Whenever I think of social connection and dementia, I think of an uncle and auntie we serviced in the community a while back. Caregivers often live by one quiet rule. If I stop, everything will fall apart. Auntie lived by that rule. For years, she cared for uncle as his dementia slowly changed their lives together. When asked how she was doing, she always smiled and said, "We manage." But behind those words was exhaustion, loneliness, and a grief no one had named yet. Before becoming a full-time caregiver, Auntie was a regular at Jamaat Khan. It was a part of her rhythm, her social circle, her spiritual grounding, her sense of belonging. But as Uncle's needs grew, she slowly stopped going. One became many. Months passed. Her world grew smaller. Uncle, in the meantime, grew anxious. He would follow Auntie from room to room. Daily tasks became tense, not because he was being difficult, just because he was really scared. His world no longer made sense. When respite was first mentioned to Auntie, she hesitated. Social connection was not at her top of mind. If someone else looks after her, what will I have to do then? What does that leave for me? What she couldn't see yet was that carrying everything alone was breaking them both. On the first day of her respite, after continuous counseling, Uncle went to a small community program. Nothing fancy, a warm room, some familiar faces, familiar music, and gentle voices. At first, he searched for Auntie. Then someone greeted him with a name. Someone sat beside him. An activity was placed in front of him, not just as a task, but as an invitation. His hands started moving. His shoulders softened. The restlessness eased. In that moment, Uncle was not a patient. He was a person again, seen, included, and valued. Back home, Auntie rested. She slept deeply, without listening for footsteps or worrying about the next question she may have to answer. When she woke up, she cried, not from guilt for the first time, but from relief. That evening was different too. She noticed the change in Uncle's behavior. Uncle was calmer. Personal care felt gentler. The calm from the day came home with him. And over the time, that difference made further clear. Social connection gave uncle a rhythm, routine, and safety, and it gave auntie the space to breathe, to return to Jamaica, and to remember who she was. And something beautiful happened between them. When she felt lighter, she was more patient. When he felt safer, he trusted more. Social connection did not fall apart, it brought them back together to each other. I now have the pleasure of introducing you to our speaker for today's session, Dr. Naheed Rajabali. Dr. Naheed is an assistant clinical professor with the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta. He received his training in internal medicine and geriatric medicine at the University of Alberta. He primarily works at the Royal Alexandra Hospital on the acute inpatient ward and consult service, as well as on the geriatric medicine emergency department consult service. He delivered care at the Parkinson's disease and movement disorder program at the Kaye Edmonton Clinic in collaboration with the Department of Neurology. He's particularly interested in devising approaches to tailoring care across various disease settings, particularly in the perioperative setting. He also enjoys teaching. We would like to thank you for taking the time today to be here, Dr. Rajabali. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mumtaz. What a beautiful story of the couple going through the changes that they did, the ups and downs, and then eventually finding peace and happiness and meaning and affection, in the end. So the title of the talk, of course, is reflective of what we will discuss today, which is social engagement and loneliness in dementia, and why this connection matters. What we'll look at today, now I've heard that between the various, we're fortunate to have so many different committees and care of the elderly, health board, and so on, who have put together many talks on dementia, cognitive health. So I've heard that many of you are already familiar with much of this. But for those who are sort of new to this or just joining, I thought I would at least touch upon some of the foundations of dementia, and then we can focus a bit more on the social aspects and loneliness and so on. So we'll look at just at the beginning, what healthy aging is in terms of the brain, what's normal, what's not normal, what's dementia, understanding some of the causes, understanding the stages, and then we'll look at what to do in each of the stages. What things caregivers, loved ones can do. And then we can understand how loneliness and social isolation can impact people with dementia, and look at strategies on how to mitigate or help in this situation. First, just to put you guys sort of at the forefront of medicine, we don't look at numeric age anymore. We look at physiologic age. We call it intrinsic capacity. But essentially, we look at intrinsic capacity, or the strength or the resilience of an organ, which many of us are familiar with, the brain being one of them. And of course, as the brain erodes, more so in a disease state, you can get into dementia, and we'll look at that. But systems can change in the body, they can erode. And at the functional level, you can have people that are still robust. You have 70, 80-year-olds playing tennis and still doing things. And yet sometimes we see people who are young in age who have more needs. And so it's not really age dependent. And so we have a term called intrinsic capacity or physiologic reserves. So the important thing here, it also ties into, is that changes in cognition does happen with age. Lots of things happen. From age 50 and onwards, processing speed goes down a little bit. Of course, other things also happen too. The body is designed to be eroded after some time. It doesn't last forever, as we know. So if you had your own sort of Olympics competing with your 20-year-old self with some sort of brain Olympics, you'll probably lose if you are sort of 50, 60, or 70, right? However, even though there is some decline, in healthy aging and normal functioning, one shouldn't have any impact to functioning. So if you're working or your loved one or somebody you know is still working, they should have no difficulties with working or driving, unless, of course, they have issues with their vision, right? No issues managing finances, medications, and so on. And with age, you can learn a new skill at any time. There is not an age where you cannot. So if you want to learn an instrument at 90 and you don't have dementia, you should be able to learn a new skill at 90, no problem. And so you have individuals, sort of in their 70s and 80s who are acquiring high school diplomas. They've maybe had to, look after family, right? Or whatever issues they've had to do in life. And then later, when they don't have any other sort of commitments or they can maybe finally afford it or something, you have them going back to school, like this lady here who acquired a degree at the age of 84. So you should be able to learn new complex tasks. And so the general rule is, in healthy aging, you should not have any functional decline. And I say this because a lot of times we move the goalpost. And when problems arise, for some reason, everybody blames it on aging and things can get missed, or we don't try to live a proactive life. I try to get this message out all the time, but because I think it's always important, right? So we have physical frailty, we can have dementia, which is cognitive erosion, and of course, there's psychiatric issues as well that can happen. Okay, well, having said all of that, let's focus on the topic today. So dementia. What is dementia? Well, essentially you have the brain, which like any other organ is susceptible to disease. One such disease is dementia. This happens when the brain is unable in an irreversible way to perform day-to-day functioning. And it's not explained by a primary psychiatric issue like schizophrenia, where you can get discombobulated and not be able to work. It's not because of an infection in the brain that's acute, right? Or immediate stroke. And we do not conflate or blame the physical limitations. So if somebody needs help with bathing, that's one thing, but that may not explain why they cannot book their own doctor's appointments or flights anymore. So that's dementia. And there are many causes that can impact the brain: memory, focus, insight. All those are aspects which can then lead to impact the day-to-day functioning, like we talked about. The list of what can cause dementia is almost endless. And so, it could be proteins. When we think of proteins, we think of things like, Alzheimer's. There's a frontotemporal dementia, all sorts. Okay, Alzheimer's is just the most common type that we know of. But there's vascular, there's trauma if you have trauma to the brain, psychiatric symptoms for some people over time can cause it. And like I said, anything that destroys brain cells over time causes dementia. So, here you can see patients with severe Alzheimer's, the brain structure has shrunk because it's lost and the function is lost as a result. In this here on the right, somebody's had a big stroke, and depending on if it's big or recurrent, sometimes function never comes back, including memory and ability to plan. So, I kind of put the criteria for it, but we've essentially talked about it. So I'll leave it there for those who may want to reference it later. But it really says that there's no age limit to when you can have dementia. If you have difficulties with functioning compared to before, there's not an age where you can say this is normal. So we need to move away from that. Okay, so once we know that there's dementia, it's important to appreciate the stages of it. Then you know what to expect, what to prepare for, and what to do at each stage, including as a caregiver, as a community, how you can support that person. So there's different ways in which we look at severity. And severity essentially is based on this premise that when your brain starts to have dysfunctioning, or when it starts to sort of unravel, when it starts to lose brain cells, you lose the things that have the least amount of connections or plasticity, like we call it. What things have the least amount of plasticity? The things you learn last in life. The things that you learn today, you haven't had a chance to build upon. But the things you learned very early in life, you kept building over and over, and it got stronger and stronger. So when you lose things that you learned later in life, or you can't remember things that you just learned, those are mild. As you get into things that are very strong initially, that you learned when you were a child, like how to put on your clothes or remembering to bathe, then you start getting into the moderate to severe stages of things. When you can no longer speak and you've lost the ability to communicate, then you're into the severe. Okay. And so these changes are not normal in aging. In the mild and early stages, people may feel slower. If you have a caregiver or if you're a caregiver or a loved one to somebody who's working and they start to develop dementia at work, they will sort of feel foggy, stressed. They won't understand why they cannot do as well, and they may go for a basic screening test that a family doctor might give, or sometimes even a specialist. They may score well, and people say, "Don't worry, you don't have any memory problems." But those early screening tests, they're not strong enough to detect dementia. People won't think about it. So the person notices, and that can cause a lot of anxiety. They're not as sharp at work. They're not as sharp in high stakes situation. But you need to advocate for them. Driving may feel iffy, but they may be scared to express that. You might notice it. It may cause a point of contention and arguments, right? They may have difficulty doing tasks like booking doctor's appointments or flights and so on. And they can then lose confidence. So the thing that you could do as a society or as a caregiver, or knowing somebody who might experience this, is to think, are they developing some dementia? Is there something else going on? Is their thyroid okay? But you advocate. So talk to your doctor, talk to another one if they don't listen, but you push and you advocate for them. Before diagnosis of dementia is confirmed, advocate, really. And ask for referral to specialists. It takes nothing for your primary care physician to make a referral, maybe a few minutes to kind of make that, but if something's off, advocate. So that's what we can do in a community and society and caregiver setting. Now, once a diagnosis is made, then you need to kind of come to terms with things like, can they still work? How long will they be able to work for? More importantly, make sure they get the personal directive power of attorney done while they still have decision-making ability. When you have mild dementia, early dementia, you still are very capable of making sound decisions. And this is a chance to kind of get those things done. Also, think about it. If you're still working, there's a chance that you may not work for too long if you're already struggling, right? And so think about hobbies and interests. Some people, and especially, you want to call it baby boomers, many of these guys, they've kind of worked hard for their family members. They've never thought about themselves. So many of them haven't picked out hobbies. And then it becomes a scary thought to now pick up an instrument. But what you can do as a caregiver or somebody in society, a community, is you can encourage them to pick up new skills and interests. Encourage them to volunteer. There actually is some evidence that there is some potential protective chemicals for the brain, but it also is good for the spirit. Exercise and learning new skills. Yeah. So those are things that can be done in that setting. It also reduces isolation as well. And so for people who are sort of slowing down physically, you may then want to also think about the possibility of living in an independent living facility where a lot of things are done for you. And if you take the stress of having your brain to do things now, you can focus on the things you enjoy and more meaningful things. So that's it, but it's a sensitive discussion, and so it's one to talk about. Okay. All right, we've sort of talked a little bit about this here. So in mild to moderate, essentially, so that's early to mild. Now let's move on to mild to moderate. I kind of give it in ranges because there's no clear-cut definition always about mild to moderate or moderate is. So I kind of give ranges, right? But in mild to moderate, the effect of the decline is more noticeable. What you see is that the loved one or the patient impacted by dementia, they want to initiate, they want to do something. But what used to be very easy to do can be complicated. So they don't do it. They won't do it spontaneously. They won't follow up on things. They may have trouble recalling conversations. They may understand things in the moment, but later they may not understand. And so, what this can look like to some people's depression. So I often sometimes get people say, "Hey, so and so I know I think they're depressed," but that's not the case. They're actually not depressed. They just look like it because they don't spontaneously do something because it's daunting or it looks complicated for them. But if you tell them, "Hey, let's do something," they'll say, "Oh yeah, I'd love to." That's not depression. So what they need is structure. They need to be somewhere or have a plan where that structure and the plan's created for them that they can then participate in and enjoy. So that's something to keep in mind. That's just the foundations of this. So predictability helps, planning the week in advance. So some of the people in this stage don't like surprises. It throws them off and they get anxious, they feel nervous. Last minute changes do all that, right? Quite frankly, when my wife tells me last minute that we have to do shopping or some task, it throws me off. If I ever get dementia, God forbid, I can only imagine how I might be, right? So, okay. So why this matters? So, uh, planning and structure reduces the cognitive load and anxiety, and then you can be in the moment a little more. You can actually then um, engage socially. You can do things you enjoy. Uh, if you have more days where you're successfully getting through things, then you preserve confidence of that person. And they just, they may enjoy just being, engaging in their day-to-day activities. So other things you may notice at this stage, medications being missed, duplicated. Sometimes you get patients coming to the hospital because they've missed the medications. They're supposed to be on heart failure, water pills. They miss, and then they show up in florid heart failure. So what a loved one can do in this setting is kind of, tactfully keep an eye on things, and where needed, you may need the help of a blister pack or reminders or home care, right? I also say at this stage, sometimes we get patients coming to the clinic or the hospital without caregivers or family because understandably it can be very busy. But then you don't get a good history. The patient doesn't remember what you've told them. So, this is a chance to sort of join the family member, the loved one as well. Okay, this is also the stage where we see a lot of friction. So we're talking about isolation and social engagement. But if dementia hasn't been diagnosed or nobody thinks that they may have dementia, you can imagine a lot of friction that we see. Loved ones start, bickering, fighting. So and so is not throwing out the garbage anymore. So and so is not remembering. They don't want to do this anymore. And the person themselves might not know what's happening to them. So if you don't have that understanding, we can talk about all the social activities and supports, but if there's friction, that's not going to happen. So you need to, give the loved one the benefit of the doubt in most situations. Okay. Now, when we get into the moderate stages of things, moderate to severe, this is where more supports are needed. Safety becomes a bit of an issue. And before you can think about socially engaging and so on, you need to establish safety. So if somebody's falling at home because now, they're impulsive, they're maybe physically frail, they're not using their walker, or they're leaving the stove on, you can't think about kind of engaging them in meaningful things if you don't have safety established. It's going to be an ongoing point of contention in and out of hospital. So it's very important that you get safety established first. What you might see are changes in behavior, personality, more agitation. They may be more anxious. Their insight and judgment might be impaired. And so these things need to be established first and foremost. Okay, so at this stage, people need cueing for activities of daily living and might need cueing. Okay, we need to get up, we need to go up the stairs, we need to do this. It can take a lot. And if you're not prepared for this, then as a caregiver, also just in the community, that can take a lot of your energy just to be there to cue a loved one. So then what's left as far as then engaging them socially goes or trying to do something affectionate, right? So it's in this situation, then you may want to consider things like supportive living. So rather than you being sort of, I would call it in a way like a business partner, right? Or like a employed caregiver, but you're not employed. You're spending so much of your time cueing them that there's not enough time left for that touch, that affectionate, engaging human touch. I say you need to have the sensitive discussion of potentially considering having supports at home if possible. Maybe strangers, people might not like the idea, especially the person with dementia, but you may need to do that or move into a supportive living, assisted living. So then if you take those tasks off of you, those, I mean, I don't want to call them burden, but it's strain, then you can be there more in a human way. And then that loved one doesn't feel alone, you know. Again, I don't have dementia, but when, my wife and I, we get busy with the kids, we're almost like business partners. And we say, listen, we need to take time for each other and be affectionate, right? So this is not the same thing, but you can sort of extrapolate for those of us who may be in a similar sort of situation with our spouses or partners and so on, right? I've said a lot of this, so what I'll do is I will leave it up here so you can use it as reference. So now, one thing that may happen is you might decide as the loved one, caregiver, or the agent on the personal directive that so and so needs to move. But if this patient, or I can when I say patient, but if the loved one with dementia doesn't have good insight and judgment, they may say, I don't want to do it. And that in itself causes a huge point of contention. So a lot of friction there. And that can cause a lot of caregiver burnout. So in this case, it's important to, if you have a personal directive established, excellent, personal directive power of attorney. But if you don't, you then may need to have a capacity assessment and have something like a guardian or trusteeship done. So ask your family doctor about this because otherwise you may see the loved one going into the hospital, in and out, or waiting there for a while until then they're forced to be placed or something like that, right? And that can create all sorts of other issues. So yeah. Um, and of course, because of often superimposed physical limitations, so people may have physical disabilities on top of cognitive, they may not be able to go anywhere. So social engagements decreased. They may have you, but if you're their business partner, they may not have that affection. You're just trying to get tasks done. And it's so important at this stage when they're not able to sort of physically function, when they don't maybe have a sense of meaning, for you to be able to be there for them, to connect, because you need to light that spark in there. That counts for something, counts for a lot. So, right, okay. I've kind of talked about all sorts of risks in this setting, but um, yeah. The other thing then to consider at this stage too is goals of care, sort of in the severe, moderate to severe, where they may need more like compassion or less medical, less invasive, because those things can actually be more harmful. Um, so there's a good website to have these kinds of discussions. Sometimes for me, it may seem obvious that goodness, this patient is very, not capable of doing a lot of things. But for a lot of family members, they haven't had a chance to think about it so much. And so if you sometimes not having comfort measures means then you're sort of hedging and you're trying to keep the patient in all sorts of treatments, but not providing them a proper level of comfort that may be best suited for their stage of where they are. Okay, so once all of that is taken care of, then it's really important to take a look at loneliness, social isolation, and engagement. So let's talk a little bit about that. What's loneliness? Loneliness is a subjective feeling of being disconnected. So you can have so many people around you, but yet you don't feel like you're being connected. And social isolation is the actual objective lack of social connection. So um, especially if you don't want it. I mean, some people, they go, to Tibet, monks, they want to be isolated, this and that, right? But a lot of people, and maybe for a short time of being, but a lot of people, there's value in social connection. It brings about something very special as human beings to be able to connect. And it brings about happiness, joy, sense of meaning. Um, okay. So why does this matter? So with dementia, people that are high risk of not having social connection. So communication becomes harder. They may be hard on themselves. If they're usually with their friends talking about politics or whatever the heck is happening, all of a sudden everything goes over their head. They also notice that too. So they don't want to be embarrassed. They fear failure. They fear that they may say something that may make them feel humiliated, right? And then others too might withdraw. If they're talking to that person, they don't realize they have dementia, or maybe they do, or maybe they don't. They may say, this person is not really engaging, it's kind of awkward. So those things can happen. Um, and as dementia progresses, people, they do less and less spontaneously. If nobody encourages them, they just sort of shrivel away. And the dependence increases. They become more deconditioned because they're not getting up. And so it becomes harder. So you're trying to really push against all of that to try to get them out and doing something. So loneliness is associated with depression and anxiety, overall worse quality of life. People lose a sense of meaning. There's increased caregiver stress. They see their loved one like this, they feel bad in their hearts, and then it's increased chance of mortality. Now, loneliness, we're not sure if it clearly causes dementia. There's associations, but there's many things that loneliness and dementia may have. However, people with dementia, the low engagement may actually worsen functioning, worsen behaviors, and reduce resilience. Social engagement then is a chance to actually, go the other way and improve all of that. So it provides emotional connection, meaningful participation. People feel involved. Simple things like, cleaning up of, in Puerto Rico, we have our Jamaat Khanas, participating, having a sense of purpose and belonging. There's also evidence-based data that shows that it improves mood and behavior, reduces distress, agitation. Caregivers feel less burden and stress, and perhaps it does slow down general functional decline. If not maybe cognitive, then physical or combinations of both, but certainly there is something there that it helps. So it may not stop the progression of dementia, but it actually improves the overall quality and sense of well-being in spite of that. So in mild dementia, it preserves a sense of identity and contribution. I tell people, what is identity? Some people push their identity on things like their jobs. And when they're no longer able to work or be that person, the person with the taxes in the family, now they can't do it, they lose who they are, and then they don't have a sense of contribution. But in dementia, you tell people, you're not your job. You are that kind of person who did this. You are that person who wants to explore. You associate their identity with their attributes. Then you then allow them to do that social activity that they can then apply those attributes and contribute towards that, right? So if they like to be the person who did this stuff in the family or did this, well, if they can't do that, apply it in a different setting. Find another setting that they can do it in. Okay. And planning and structure helps with independence, having structure. In mild to moderate, that's the sense of loss of identity and lack of contribution is amplified. So it's more important to have sort of predictable routines, supported participations, perhaps being in an environment with people with dementia or mixed with dementia without, right? We'll look at some examples. And in moderate to severe, this is where a lot of mood and behavior can change. So it's important to have emotional connections, sensory connections, music, activities, hand activities, also anything that impacts the senses in a positive way can help. A sense of presence, familiarity, calmness, all of that can help. Okay. So, I will look at one study that was published because, I have to give a lot of credit and kudos to, the Care of the Elderly and the Health Board and everybody who's put this together. They're really at the forefront of what needs to be done. And it's because the studies show it. So there's probably more and more studies in the last 5 years, 2 years, 1 year that's recognizing the exact same thing that the committee who's put this together is asking, us to talk about, which is loneliness and isolation. So I'll just look at a study that was just done recently of 501 people involved in dementia care. And these are individuals that are mostly family members or professional caregivers, and they wanted to understand them. They did a survey. They wanted to understand what type of social interactions actually occur, which interactions matter the most, what helps or hinders connection, and what kind of social engagement or activities are perceived to actually improve symptoms and quality of life. It's a very interesting study. And what they found, for example, is where did most of the social interactions happen? So at home, 60%, or at day programs for those who are, neighborhoods or social spaces, and then things like clinics, religious events, errands. Now, in some cultures or communities, things like religious events or places of worship may actually be a very important area of social connection, which is a very positive thing. In the greater community, it may not necessarily be that way. But this is sort of one advantage of some communities, that may actually be doing this. Social engagement's already happening in care spaces, not public ones. So that means that could be an opportunity to do something. If everything is sort of a big chunk is happening at home, the idea is perhaps meet them where they are, or be innovative and creative and create other places where interactions can happen. On the flip side, if you try to rely on interventions that rely on travel, novelty, you might miss many patients. So, find out what's happening regionally, what kind of demographic you're dealing with, and what you can be able to achieve as far as creating spaces of engagement. Okay, so the most valuable interactions when they looked at, well, what kind of interactions did people actually appreciate? It's just the ones we take for granted. Okay, and Aga Khan, the fourth, the late Aga Khan the fourth, he always talked about smiles, and a lot of these things they seem kind of, you know, I'm lacking words today, but maybe people think it's kind of fluffy. But there is value in the things that we take for granted. So the top interactions were 83% smiles, touch, close to 80%, telling of life stories. So listening and telling, simply just looking at each other, singing, conversations, those kinds of things that we don't think about mattered a lot more in this setting. What was a bit less valued, we're talking about fears and talking about the future. So people wanted to be in the now. What's happening now. Let's not so much worry about the future, geopolitical, my future, your future. I mean, there's a practical sense to thinking about the future and planning, but within the present interaction, people just simply appreciated smiles and stories and such. Keeping in mind, of course, that every individual is unique. So if whoever you're engaging with likes talking about the future, well, just go ahead and talk about the future, but the most important thing is connection requires your presence. We don't have a blood test to show that your presence as a caregiver, a loved one, or even a community can do something. We don't have the tests yet to show or prove any of this, but we're starting to see data. People, we know it, we sense it, we see it day to day. And that in itself is like a treatment or medication. Okay, so now what still works even in advanced dementia? So things like singing or humming. People forget the words to songs, but singing or humming still. Good touch, old hands, moving together. If the patient's mobile, then dancing, right? Familiar objects, because again, you lose the things that have the least amount of plasticity. So the things that you were familiar with are the ones that still stay. Okay, and then mirroring gestures. So if somebody's talking or using their hands, mirroring shows that you're sort of on the same page. So, what are other things that may help increase social interaction? So, participate participants tended to agree, not that strongly, but certainly there was some agreement that social interaction preserves cognition, it improves quality of life, and reduces symptoms. And other studies also support this as well. So, what mattered the most overall? So, actively initiating interactions, so being there, being present, initiating conversation. Remember, the person with dementia may not necessarily do that. They may be shy, they may be worried, they may not remember. So, if you do it, that's what matters. A consistent social contact beyond the primary caregiver, right? I call it business partner. If you can reduce the amount of tasks and queuing you have to do to be able to be there, to smile and hold hands and talk about these things that lift the spirit, that's what mattered the most. Okay? Community, cultural, and religious programs. That has a huge impact. Good communication between families and professionals. So again, a lot of advocating, as if you're a family member, advocate, reach out. And as a community, you can certainly play a role in this as well. I mean, look, this is already happening, which is in itself incredible, right? So, and I personally, I thank our institutions for doing this stuff. So we're already there. We're doing this, right? So, and then as far as technology and robots, there's a lot of literature emerging around this, right? But if you ask the people on the front lines, they had neutral to skeptical views about it. There likely will be a role. So I'm not discounting technology, and I think there's some evidence that shows that there may be good use for it in dementia, and explore, experiment, but the bottom line here is that the human touch, the human presence was the most important. And then tech is sort of optional. Well, Monday, maybe our tech will be so good that, I mean, anyway, some of this AI stuff, they look like they're real, who knows? Maybe that will be, you can turn a tool like that into something positive for patients with dementia, so, I'm open-minded, and I think it's important for the community to be open-minded with ideas and innovations as well of how to introduce technology into this sort of setting in a positive way. So practical stages, then in a nutshell, communication that validates feelings, activities grounded in personal history, familiar routines and environment. But there's examples like memory cafes where people with dementia, plus or minus, their loved ones are there. They can sort of empathize with each other. They can empathize with each other, communicate. It's nice to be in the presence of somebody else who's going through something similar to you, right? Music or faith-based groups, and intergenerational activities. So there are, multi-generational facilities. I think even, for example, generations that brings, daycare children, young children, school children to play. My two daughters did that when they were younger, and they loved it. Where we saw photos and videos of the people at the facilities, and they loved it. Playing with the balloons, and the elders there were teaching the young ones how to do something, and vice versa. It was anyway. Those are other things that can be considered, right? Now, when in person isn't possible, there's video calls. We live in a good era for that kind of stuff, right? Shared music or photos and sensory therapies. So whatever that may be, there's not one that shows that it's better than the other, and every individual is different. But try art, music. There's pets. Try something, and that might also help with behavior and personality changes, or with agitation, anxiety, mood. So, in a nutshell, there's some key takeaways to keep in mind that dementia is not one experience. The needs and supports can change across stages. For some people, slower, faster, and that the loss of initiative on the part of the patient or the person with dementia does not mean that there's loss of interest or desire for connection. They just don't know how to connect the dots anymore. And sometimes that's all they need is somebody to help connect the dots, whether it's a loved one, caregiver, structured environment, a facility, a program. And so that, that can help. Loneliness and social isolation, they are related to one another, but loneliness is a feeling. You may have everybody around you, but if in your heart you feel that you're not engaging, you're not useful, you don't belong, then it doesn't matter how many people are around you, you feel loneliness. Social isolation means you do want to do something, but nobody's there. There's no contact. What can help with both is engagement, social engagement. And people with dementia are at risk of having both loneliness and social isolation. So engagement at every stage has value and meaning. It improves quality of life. It improves the quality of life of the caregiver. Yeah. And then as dementia progresses, things like safety, dignity, and comfort become increasingly important goals. And even in advanced dementia, connection is still possible. It may look different of how you do that, but it's still very much possible and very much important. Well, I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajabali. This was a wonderful and enlightening presentation. Thank you for doing this. A few things that really stayed with me. That importance of having structure when planning engagement activities to reduce the cognitive load, that really stayed with me because that's very important. And the other one was different engagement activities for different stages of dementia. That was amazing to consider and understand. So thank you for all of that. We would like to leave you all with some helpful resources. For the latest updates and information, please visit iicanada.org. For personalized support and resources, you can always connect the AXA line by scanning the QR code. In some regions, we do have memory cafes to support families living with a person with dementia, and smiley centers are also available in many Jamaat Khanas across Canada. For more information on that, please connect with your local Care for the Elderly member, and they would be able to assist you. You can also access resources to the Alzheimer's Society for your region. This brings us to the end of today's session. I would like to thank again Dr. Naheed Rajabali for sharing his knowledge and expertise with us. Lastly, thank you to our audience. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and learned a few things. We would appreciate if you could fill out the evaluation form to provide feedback for the webinar today. Your feedback is important to us and allows us to improve our programming for the future. Please scan the QR code for the evaluation form. We will also follow up with an evaluation form via email for those who have registered. Until next time, thank you and Yalumadat.